hearing today. Again, today we're having a community conversation with those willing to step up and serve us citizens here for Lake County for the state's attorney's race. On behalf of the League of Women Voters, we're excited to have you here. We're excited that we have the National Honor Society for Round Lake High School helping out with today's event. And we're grateful for our participating partners with the radio station and also with Comcast. And we look forward to you reviewing this on the rebroadcast. They're going to start next Sunday. So thanks. For the next half hour, we're going to have a conversation regarding the Lake County State's Attorney's race and what the issues are. So truly make sure you see one of these volunteers, take one of the white index cards, put your questions on it, give it to our question sorters. They'll make sure they get it to me so we can ask your questions. So thank you for willing to be informed constituents and getting out to exercise that right to vote here now for early and grace period voting, and then also for the actual primary, which is going to be on March 15th. With that, we've already had a discussion and drew numbers to see the order of who's making open comments first. And our two candidates for the Democratic ticket for the Lake County State's Attorney's race are Michael J. Perillo, Jr. and also Matt Stanton. And Matt, I do believe that you've got the opportunity to go first. So I'd like to invite you to the podium and make up to a 1.5 minute opening comment.
Thank you. My name is Matt Stanton. I'm running for the office of State's Attorney for one primary purpose, and that's to restore public trust in the State's Attorney's office. I plan to do that by demanding accountability of every employee with the commitment that no one will go to prison for a crime they did not commit, and no one will escape justice for a crime that they did commit. I think the office needs to be restructured. A little bit about myself. This is the first time that I'm running for office. In the 1980s, I started out my working life at O'Hare Airport as an airline mechanic. By the early 1990s, I had become a single parent of 5 children. As you can imagine, that was a busy existence, and I went to school. I went to college in the 1990s. When my kids were old enough for me to be for me to go away to night school, that's what I did. We came home and we hit the books together. 16 years ago, I made the decision to go to law school. I've been a practicing attorney, an educator. I'm also a law professor at one of the law schools as an adjunct. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, candidate. Candidate Michael?
Thank you, and let me start out by thanking the League and the library and everyone else who's involved in putting on this program. It is certainly a great opportunity and a privilege to speak with all of you about the state's attorney's race. My name is Mike Perillo. I'm a candidate for the Democratic nomination for Lake County State's Attorney. I seek the office because I seek the privilege of public service, and if elected, I will provide Lake County with the best state's attorney's office in the state of Illinois. By way of background, I've been a practicing attorney for over 32 years. I started out as a Navy JAG lawyer here at Great Lakes in the middle 1980s. In that capacity, I prosecuted court-martial cases, and I was also in an administrative role at one of the schools commands over here. After that, I was a felony assistant in the Lake County Public Defender's Office, and after that, I was a felony assistant right here in the Lake County State's Attorney's Office. Since 1992, I've been in private practice here in Waukegan. All of my 32 years of legal practice have been here in Lake County, and I've lived here for all of those 32 years. Again, I thank you for being here. I ask for your vote and for the opportunity to serve. Thank you.
Thank you, candidates, for your opening comments. Now we'll get to the heart of today's discussion and communication conversation, and we'll ask the questions that are important to you. We'll start with the first question, and candidate Michael, you'll go first. What do you believe is the most important responsibility of the Lake County State's Attorney?
The most important responsibility is getting it right the first time. We've had, unfortunately, a history in Lake County of wrongful convictions. I will certainly make that the avoidance of wrongful convictions my first and foremost priority. In that regard, I proposed an in-house conviction integrity unit, which would be a full-time unit in the office. The unit would be staffed by an attorney, a paralegal, an investigator, and the unit would have the opportunity to draw on all the resources of the office. It would be a threefold task: to review older cases, to ensure conviction integrity, to learn from the mistakes of the past, to monitor new cases to make sure those mistakes are not repeated, and thirdly, to engage in training in-house and hopefully for investigators outside of the office, again, to ensure that those types of mistakes are not repeated in the future.
Thank you, candidate.
Could you repeat the question?
Absolutely. First question is, what do you believe is the most important responsibility of the Lake County State's Attorney?
The most important responsibility is to show and exercise immediately courage and moral leadership in an office, as Mr. Perillo has said, where so much wrongful prosecutions have come out of. Now, a lot of those were built in the previous administration to Mr. Naram, who's the incumbent, but Mr. Naram has, out of inheriting the 144 employees that he inherited, he did not replace a single one. It is not a reform to release an innocent person when that's proven to you. What is a reform is to replace those individuals, that cast of characters that's consistently coming forward with these wrongful prosecutions. There has to be a hard look at the existing attorneys, and there has to be some replacements made.
Thank you, candidates. Go ahead and hang on to the mic. I just realized I am a mom, and my boys are Matt and Mike. So I am going to have to defer to your last name. So
Which one's your favorite?
I think your parents will appreciate it.
They're both favorites, right?
Absolutely.
I know.
Mother never chooses. So second question, candidate Stanton, what can the state's attorney do to prevent crime?
Well, I think an important role of the state's attorney is to address recidivism, which is preventing repeat crime. And there are different programs. There is a drug court that we currently have in Lake County that I would favor developing more and expanding that. There's also a deferred prosecution program that's been put in place under state law that I favor adopting here in Lake County, that involves first-time nonviolent felonies, which basically allows supervision for those felonies. It requires the participation of the victim and the sheriff's department, the policing departments, and the judiciary. But it allows those first-time nonviolent felons to potentially expunge their case, which makes it easier for them if they've completed all the conditions. They have to be at work and in school and/or to reintegrate into society.
Thank you, candidate Stanton.
Perillo.
Oh, Perillo, sorry. Thank you, candidate Stanton.
The prevention of crime, I believe, is twofold. I agree that certainly we need to prevent recidivism, and there are programs in place here in Lake County which address that. I certainly support them all. I would certainly look to enhance all of those programs. But beyond that, I believe that certain crime is prevented by strong and tough prosecution. Crimes committed with handguns and firearms need to be dealt with severely. I think we need to show in Lake County that we're serious about that. And if elected, I would certainly take a zero-tolerance approach to any type of crimes committed with firearms or handguns.
Thank you, candidate Perillo. Go ahead and hang on to that. The next question deals with child support and visitation issues. Those issues can be particularly complicated situations. Do you have any comments on dealing with this aspect of the job?
None in particular, no. I do believe, I know the state's attorney's office gets involved in child support and child support enforcement, and I would certainly want to take a very hard look at that. Nothing's more important than our kids. I have a daughter. We all know how important our children are. We know how important it is to have the financial means to take care of our children. So what I would say in answer to the question is I would take a hard look at that, and I would make sure that our office is doing everything possible to see that children are getting the support, the court order that they need and deserve.
Thank you, candidate. Candidate Stanton.
Yes, the state's attorney does have a child support enforcement division, and there are some of the attorneys working there. Is an area especially where I think experienced attorneys benefit us having them in the child support enforcement division. That is available to citizens regardless of a means test if you are owed child support. The one development that I've seen, and I don't know if it's a rule or if it's just a judicial between the state's attorney's office and the judiciary, is lately the child support questions are being handled separate and apart from other extenuating circumstances like visitation and other problems like that. I would favor a way to have those cases integrated into the whole of the divorce case. It would take some examination to do that. Clearly these are complex areas. I do believe the state has a role, an important role in the collection of child support.
Thank you, candidate. The next question is dealing with the county of reversals. Lake County is perceived by many as the county of reversals. Judges have suggested prosecutorial misconduct or incompetence as a cause. How would you approach to the office address these issues?
Who is that to?
Candidate Stanton.
This is a very difficult question on how to resolve it. I think it's sometimes moral leadership means taking the harder position when you could take an easier one. I think the first thing to look at in this office is who are the people that are consistently involved in the wrongful prosecutions. All of the big wrongful prosecutions of recent years that have resulted in so much loss to the taxpayers. Jerry Hobbs, Juan Rivera, James Edwards, Bernie Starks, these cases. These involve the actual innocence. These people were released because they were actually innocent. The other thing that was common thread is they all confessed. Now, I think we have to take a hard look at the interrogation techniques that are being used, and as a state attorney, to make sure that the physical evidence is also goes along with the confession.
Thank you. Candidate Perillo.
I learned in my brief tenure in the Navy that leadership is by example, and that's the type of leadership I will provide if elected to the office. I would intend to be the first person in the office in the morning and the last one out at night. Specifically, with regard to this issue, I've touched upon it before. I would establish the Conviction Integrity Unit. Unlike the organization as I understand it exists today, which is made up of volunteers, mine would be full-time, and there would be a full-time lawyer who I would bring in from outside of the office to run that unit. The unit would look at past cases for integrity of prosecution. The unit would look at current cases to ensure that past mistakes were not made, and the unit would engage in training. There is no substitute for consistent, effective training, both in the office and outside the office, and that goes with any organization whatsoever. Training is the key, leadership is the key. That is what I would bring to the office.
Thank you. Candidate Perillo, you also answer this one first. The state's attorney's office is responsible for prosecuting criminal acts and for providing legal representation for Lake County and its elected officials. What would you do if discovered that those two goals were in conflict?
Repeat that question.
Yes. The state's attorney's office is responsible for prosecuting criminal acts and for providing legal representation for Lake County and its elected officials. What would you do if you discovered, if it was discovered that those two goals were in conflict?
If I understand the question correctly, it is suggesting a hypothetical wherein the state's attorney's office would be defending a public official, and at some point in the case or in the litigation or perhaps in the investigation, it was determined that the public official broke the law, or at least there would be probable cause to think that the law had been broken, my response would be the law is paramount. My response would be that if a crime is suspected, an investigation needs to be made. If, because of potential conflict of interest, the case needs to be referred out, I would immediately contact the Attorney General's office or whatever the appropriate outside prosecutorial agency would be. But again, to answer the question directly, enforcement of the criminal law is paramount, and that comes before any considerations of civil litigation or the adverse effect the prosecution might have on that civil litigation.
Thank you. Candidate Stanton?
Yes, I can conceive of several areas where there could be tension in that dual role of the state's attorney. One is, we were just talking about a moment ago, if you've got these wrongful prosecutions or cases like it that are moving in the pipeline now, that is also potentially an area that the state's attorney has to defend in a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. I guess what we have to do in that case is look at the law as paramount, as Mr. Perillo said, and follow the laws, and be willing to even prosecute a prosecutor if that's what's called for. If that tension in the office, if that's too hard, maybe it's a case where you call in a special investigator, a special prosecutor, somebody from outside. But there are ways to do that.
Thank you, candidates. The next question, Candidate Stanton, you'll go first. What will you do to ensure Governor Rauner's overreach does not affect the most vulnerable in society?
I think the question calls for me to add some, what overreach might be. But what I will do is address what we can do the most vulnerable in society, which is, I think, also a role that in the state's attorney's office. It's not a political office explicitly because we're not making law, but we are expressing the values, political values in our public policy. And I think by looking to incarcerate mentally ill people, people with drug problems, those sorts of things are wrong. And that's not what prison and incarceration is for. And we would address some of those things through the drug court or maybe through some other programs that we haven't. I've thought a good thing to do would be for the state's attorney's office to have an outreach in the schools, especially schools where you can correlate the zip code with the incarceration rate as they grow up.
Thank you. Candidate, excuse me, let's try that again. Perillo.
Thank you. I interpret the question as being one of a budgetary type nature, and we are not running for a legislative position. But having said that, to answer the question, I don't believe in spending somebody else's money. I am extraordinarily prudent in my own finances, and I would bring that to the state's attorney's office. In terms of overreach, when I hear that in the question, I'm immediately thinking of that which is going on in the legislature, the absence or presence of a budget, as it might be, and where your budgetary, where the importance of your budgetary decisions are forwarded. In terms of the state's attorney's office, what I could bring to the table would be fiscal prudence. I would go over the budget constantly and make sure every penny was going to the appropriate and effective delivery of legal services here to the citizens of Lake County. That would include the criminal division, but also the civil division. I think we can do a lot of good things in saving money and being more effective in providing civil representation to the people.
Thank you, candidate. The next question will start with you, Candidate Perillo. What sort of special care, if any, is required when dealing with crimes perpetrated by minors? Does this change when the victim is also a minor?
I think that's a rhetorical question. The answer is yes on both counts. We have a juvenile court system in which we certainly attempt to rehabilitate the juvenile offender. And in terms of juvenile victims, it is difficult for me to imagine anyone in a prosecutorial position who would not take every step possible to protect the child victim. My very first prosecution ever in the Navy was a child sex abuse case. That was 32 years ago. Since that time, I've also prosecuted child sex abuse type cases, and there's no substitute for the experience an attorney obtains in dealing with child victims and learning how to deal with those very sensitive victims.
Thank you. Candidate Stanton?
Well, I think that we do have a juvenile court that deals with teen perpetrators, and that's been for a long time set apart, but it had to be carved out of the law when it was developing in the late 1800s and the early 1900s across the country. For lesser crimes, we do have a teen court program that often involves where there's teen perpetrators and teen victims that keeps them out of the court and often imparts quite a lesson to the youngsters. And that's usually conducted by volunteer attorneys and volunteer judges. Other than that, I have great empathy for any victims of any kind, you know, having raised a family myself of children, and I think the state's attorney, it's a quality that would be admirable in the state's attorney's office, to have a sensitivity to the youthful, the harm that can come from youthful victims.
Thank you. Candidate Stanton, you'll answer the next question first. What importance is there in communicating with the media about high-profile criminal proceedings?
But especially this. How's this? Okay, we'll give it a try. Well, democracy is about transparency. And I think that light heals many things. Sunlight is good. I know that there's the state's attorney's office needs the room that they need to develop their theories and to prosecute to protect us. But given the sensitivity of the recent history of wrongful convictions, I think there has to be a special liaison from the state's attorney's office to work with the media so that the public trusts the process. Again, restoring trust, I think, is essential. There has to be accountability in the office, and I think that relations with the media are an extremely important part of that accountability factor.
Could you repeat that question for me?
What importance, we apologize, what importance is there in communicating with the media about high-profile criminal proceedings?
I am a rules person. I follow the rules, I read the rules, I read the law, and as an attorney, my conduct is dictated by the rules and by the law. We have a code of professional conduct here in Illinois, and you can look that up, you can find it online. It prescribes that which a prosecutor can share with the press during the pendency of any proceeding. And what can be shared is very limited. The nature of the charge, the identity of the defendant, that sort of thing. But it's really quite limited. So quite frankly, while the case is pending, my instruction to staff and prosecutors would be simply to read the rule, understand the rule, and follow the rule.
Thank you. The next question will start with you. What can be done to prevent tragedies like the deaths of Logan McDonald, Sandra Bland, and Tamir Rice at the hands of the police?
You know, again, I get back to the function of leadership. I think it's a difficult question because we do have in this country, as we've seen, certain instances of police misconduct. By the same token, I think it is unfair to group any group of people and paint them with a broad brush. So what really needs to be done, in my opinion, is to look at each and every case for what it is, and to have the courage to go forward with that case, depending upon what the evidence indicates and what the evidence says.
Can I get a repeat?
What can be done to prevent the tragedies like the deaths of Loquan McDonald, Sandra Bland, and Tamir Rice at the hands of the police?
Tragedies is a good way to describe it. A lot of studies show in fast developing, low information situations like the police find themselves in those cases, that oftentimes what kicks in is, besides the natural fight and flight, there's a lot of confirmation bias and things like that that go in. I don't think we can talk about this without recognizing that there's minorities are the victims. Again, if I'm talking about something, I don't think there's outright prejudicial behavior, but there is confirmation bias that can play a part in this. It's usually not there in a more casual encounter with the officers. So I would say what we need to have is training, specific training for the police in those very intense situations.
Thank you, candidate. And you can hang on to the mic for our final audience question. Tell us about a time when you were unable to offer the legal help that was requested of you. What did you do?
A time I was unable to offer the legal help?
Correct.
Well, I don't have a specific instance that comes to mind, although there are many times when I have had somebody come to my office and there was something where the law just did not provide. Every human situation is not contemplated in the law. And in those cases, I would try and steer somebody to another area where they might be able to get the help, perhaps another professional, if that's appropriate. Otherwise, it would be to try and give them a way to think about it in their life. I mean, an attorney is a counselor at law, and there have been many times when I've drawn on my coursework in psychology, which is and empathy for the people that I've been with.
Thank you.
In my life experience, have learned that in practicing law, you wear a number of different hats. First, foremost, and always, you're the attorney. But you wear the hat of counselor, and sometimes mediator, and sometimes even negotiator. When I think about the question, on the occasions where I couldn't help someone, it was typically because there was a conflict of interest. I perhaps could not help both the husband and wife in the same case. And what you do in that situation is to make that determination early on. And if necessary, you send the client to another qualified attorney, or perhaps you send both clients to two separate qualified attorneys. How does that relate to the state's attorney's office? We need to ensure that we do not run into conflicts of interest. And one of the things I proposed in the past is a no moonlighting policy in the office. If elected, I would prohibit attorneys from having outside employment outside of the office.
Thank you, candidates, and thank you, audience, for your thoughtful questions. At this time, we'll move to the closing comments, and I'd like to invite candidate Stanton to please come to the podium and make his final comments.
I think it was first on the intro.
Okay, then you will go second. Correct. Candidate Perillo?
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for your questions and for your attendance. It's important for all of us to be informed about this and every election. This is going to be a very important election this year. Quite obviously, it's a presidential year, and all of you here, will be, I believe, leaders in your different communities in terms of getting the word out as to the qualifications of the various candidates for the position for which they run. And I hope you'll take word from this forum as to what you heard from me, as to what you've heard from my qualifications, and as to what you've heard of my passion for the job. So again, thank you, and I thank the League, and I thank all of you for being here, and don't forget to get out and vote.
Thank you, Candidate Perillo. Candidate Stanton, your closing comments?
Thank you for coming. I echo Mr. Perillo's thanks to everybody for your involvement. I think there's one theme that I have throughout this, and that's accountability. That's accountability to the taxpayers of Lake County for the tens of millions of dollars that we've seen this state's attorney's office that over the last decade and a half. Accountability to the citizens for public safety, for enforcing the law, for every wrongful conviction. Well, not everyone, but in a lot of cases, the real perpetrator is still going free. And accountability that the assistant state's attorneys have to the state attorney elected position. And it's that kind of leadership and that commitment that I offer to the voters.
Thank you. Thank you, candidates, for your willingness to serve, and thank you for your thoughtful responses today. Yeah, good luck with your campaigns. Audience, at this time, it's appropriate to join me in a round of applause for both of these candidates. And all of you that might be watching at home too, the League of Women Voters does want you to exercise your voice and your choice. There are more opportunities to get information at vote411.org. No matter where you live, put in your address. It will populate the information back to your polling place. You can get information to register to vote. You can get information on grace period voting. You can get information on the deadlines, voter qualifications. Just about anything you can think of, nonpartisan related, will be available for you. We do encourage that. And most importantly, take a friend to vote. Drive them to the polling places. Make sure, because this is the most important visible thing we can do as U.S. citizens. Get out and vote. And March 15th is the date for this primary election. And truly, we hope you exercise your right back in the fall for the primary election. Grace period and early voting are now underway, so do take that opportunity. And more importantly, drive safe and enjoy the rest of the spring-like weekend. And thanks for being here today.